Okay. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, Anna.
Good afternoon.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be doing this. Anna and I have known each other for a number of years, and the reason we're doing this interview is that you, Anna, are currently in the later stages of qualifying to become a psychotherapist. You're doing your final case studies as we speak, and that's that's a journey you've been on that I've witnessed to some degree, and really wanted to talk to you about what's led you from a place where you weren't interested in those, not that you weren't interested, but where that wasn't like the direction your life was going necessarily. You had a career doing other things, into this place where it's now become this kind of very central thing in your life, and to go from there into both your transformational journey and what you are looking to bring into your work as you perform it. So, where to start that? Maybe, maybe I should ask you where to start that and just pitch it back into somewhere prior to you were involved in any of this in your earlier life. What was the sort of starting steps on this journey for you?
Yeah, thank you. It's funny when you put it like that, I realize quite how a journey it has been. But yeah, I think probably to start, it's best to go back to the first point that I started becoming interested in mental health and well-being, or even really became aware that that was a thing, was in my time at university. And so when I was about 19, 18, 19, I started to become aware that I was having challenges and that I was struggling. And I couldn't completely put my finger on what that was at the time. It just felt like I was struggling with something and it seemed to be a bit different from how other people around me were behaving or seemed to be experiencing things. And so I remember at that point looking up some services at the university I was in for some counselling, and I thought maybe that was a route that I could explore. I obviously recognized there was something emotional to do with it, but that was really the beginnings of what then became a, a very deep personal and then professional interest in mental health, well-being, emotions, the mind, everything above that, and what also then led to a kind of a spiritual understanding of the person and many things in between. But yeah, so I suppose my journey really started when I realized that I myself was struggling with life and had questions and felt that things could be better.
Can I
So
interject there?
about that,
I'd like
yeah.
to ask a couple of questions, right? Because you mentioned spirituality coming into the framework. So I'd like to know what your kind of metaphysical framework was or spiritual framework up until this point, because I know it goes through a kind of a shift. And I'd also like to know, is there a kind of like antecedents to your struggles at university? Was life just a sort of garden of roses, and then you're at university one day, and oh, now it's not a garden of roses? Or judging by how much you want to divulge around this, Anna, but what was there an antecedents to that, and where are you in terms of your outlook on life, your views on sort of philosophical questions about meaning at that point when you're at university?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, so in terms of my metaphysical or spiritual position up until that point at university, I would say it was very bog standard, secular, probably pretty atheist view of a young British woman, growing up in Southeast London, immersed in the arts and music scene and going to a pretty good school, but it was all very much on the Western modern scientific, rational, materialistic perspective of life. And went to a pretty good university and was studying social sciences. So I was on that end of the spectrum of the Western scientific model, but I'd always been interested in people and culture. I went to study anthropology. So I always had a curiosity about asking questions and looking cross-culturally to understand things differently. But I was still really very much in that position that there was no God, there was no divinity. Here we are, physical brain, body, matter, and then we die, pretty much.
So
um,
I'm curious about that. If I could get interject, you're studying anthropology, okay, and there's an interest in how different groups come to conceptualize the world differently, which is an interesting antecedent to doing therapy because you're literally trying to understand how this human being across the room from you has constructed their world. But do you think at that point, what it sounds like you're saying is there's a sense of you existing in, you know, I don't want to make you sound like some neo-colonialist, Anna, but some sort of superior position of like, you're judging from your European Enlightenment values that how do these people get the world wrong almost? Because or am I being too harsh there? Is there a curiosity about how a more, I don't know, shamanic worldview or religious worldview could arise, and how do you think you felt about that in terms of the relativism of the cultures?
it's interesting because yeah, I think in in my heart of hearts now, I believe I've always been someone that's deeply empathic and genuinely wanting to put myself in others' shoes and really understand from their perspective. Yeah, I got very interested in phenomenology at the time and that idea of the being in the world as the primacy of our philosophical understanding of humans and culture. And I that was really reflected in the topics that I chose while studying anthropology. It was all very much about deep ethnography, sensory ethnography, really trying to create ethnographic material that represented different people's cultures and minds and seeing from their different points of view. So there was always this deep kind of yearning or wanting to really understand what it was like to be in someone else's shoes and have that reflected. However, yes, I probably was still situated in that slightly now we see as very outdated philosophy of anthropology, which was the armchair view that there were these primitive cultures practicing these strange shamanic rituals, and here we were over in the West in our progressive ways, telling them how to do things, and we were right, and we needed to lead them towards proper science. And so I existed within that. Yeah, I was sort of struggling with that, with those ideologies, I think, at the time. But through my investigations of ethnography and the kinds of things I was interested in, I was pushing intellectually at that edge of something doesn't feel quite right here. So yeah, I think it's fair to say I was always deeply curious about trying to push these boundaries and explore things, but I'd reached almost like the the extent of where those ideologies in that university structure and system could take me, and the institutional view, which was very secular. There were some organisations, like sort of spiritual and religious organisations at the university. I recall it was Sussex University, so very diverse, and they pride themselves on being a very open, tolerant university, which are encouraging of lots of different religions and spiritual traditions and things. And so I remember being curious about the Buddhist Center, for example, and the Christian organization, and going along once or twice to some of their things. But I always felt that because my family hadn't been brought up in this respect as religious, while we lived by Christian values, like many British families do, we weren't explicitly religious. So I always felt that it wasn't really for me, while I was interested at the same time. So yeah, I think it's fair to say at that point, I felt safer in the worldview of Western science, and that did shape my perception of myself and the world and the kinds of thoughts I had, because I was still very much existing in the mindset that any thought I had was from my brain and I was separate from others, and my thoughts were uh, sort of like a protection system, and that was necessary because the world is dangerous and we're all just here randomly. And so I recognize now my whole worldview and thought system was really predicated on the belief system that I was brought up in. And I've seen now how drastically that can change as my worldview has changed.
So perhaps you'd describe that shift as it started to occur. And I'm wondering if the worldview you occupied led into your struggles in some way. So just like the reason I wonder that is because I went through a phase, which is, I was just saying, I was saying this to Tim Freak when I interviewed him the other day about there's almost a standard thing that you hear Westerners talk about of being brought up in a at least nominally Christian environment and then losing their religion at some point and becoming won over by the Church of Science, if you like, and a kind of materialist reductionism. And that feeling like a wonderful kind of enlightenment before it becomes a prison of its own in terms of the absence of meaning. And I went down that road, and then at the age of 17 or 18, like felt that absence of meaning. And what's the point in anything, really? It's because there's a loss of any spirit in that. So that very much accentuated like any struggles I was having internally, and ultimately led me into a more spiritual worldview, starting with Eastern spirituality, particularly. So I'm curious to know for you, if, irrespective of whatever else is going on, if that worldview you felt contributed to those struggles, or perhaps prevented you from seeing them in a way that would enable you to move through them or process them, and then how, if so, how that journey progressed for you to taking on and really embracing different worldviews.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. I think now looking back, I can see how, yeah, there was quite a lot of a crisis of meaning happening in that there was a personal story, a personal narrative going on about my life and what it had been. And in my earlier years, I had a lot of dysfunction in the family and had a lot of questions about that for a long time. You know, why was our family so different to other people's or other friends' families? So I think there was a lot of grappling I was doing with really trying to understand that for a long time, while at the same time having my this intellectual endeavor that had been pushed from early childhood, go to school, be educated, and continue in this kind of intellectual pursuit and academia, which, as I said before, was very secular, scientific worldview. So looking back, I think there was a bit of a crisis really playing out in terms of these different fragments of my mind that were really trying to piece together a cohesive worldview. And there was a struggle going on of making sense of the experiences I'd had at home and in my environment and in my life, and then this world that I was being told operated in a certain way. So yeah, I think there was a lot of things happening actually at once. But what I remember most was really coming to a sense of feeling very unsafe, very alone, very confused, and yeah, the predominant feeling and the thought was, what is the point? What is the point of all of this? So
So
yeah,
kind of a crisis of meaning
there was a crisis.
arising.
Yeah, there was a crisis of meaning, and a lot of behaviors that I developed, a lot of strategies and mechanisms to defend myself or to protect myself within this worldview in which everything was actually pretty dangerous, had reached their peak. And it was sort of like there wasn't really a way that I could function in that worldview anymore. It reached its limit. Something had to shift. So that's really where I was at that point, I would say. And yeah, and then what proceeded after that was what I'll probably go on to talk about. But yeah, that was definitely a marked moment.
Okay, so yeah, please do go on to talk about that. I guess I'm curious if there are two phases to that, at least two, in terms of attempting to look at this crisis of meaning through the paradigm you were already in and what kind of therapeutic approaches that might have led to. And then at some point, and I'm not sure where you crossed the exact point you crossed the threshold into doing anything you would consider spiritual, but I know that you had an experience where somebody mentioned non-duality to you, and that set you off on a particular course then. So I don't know if that was like a big turning point or that was one turning point amongst many. But yeah, I'd like to say for you to say however much you feel is relevant about your early efforts to change your perspective to bring some solace, and then this transition into a different worldview.
Yeah, no, so I think in the early stages, I was looking for mainstream services, as you do. I was looking via my GP, doctors, and exploring what kind of support was out there for mental health, because that's what I, saw myself to have issues with. I went down the route of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and had a number of rounds of CBT therapy for what I was experiencing, which at the time was diagnosed as social anxiety and body dysmorphia, because my main fears and anxieties at that time were revolving around interactions with people and fears about my appearance and looking strange, and they'd all become quite enmeshed, to be honest. But there really was a kind of general fear of having to interact with people. I think underneath that now there was what we might call depression. There was a lot of emotion going on, and then a lot of wanting to hide that emotion to appear functioning. So yeah, so I did go down the traditional conventional paths, exploring different ways to think about things, as CBT can be known to do. Not discrediting CBT, because I think it can be really useful, but at the time it wasn't enough for me. I still felt as though it was kind of scratching the surface of something, and there was still this deep sense in me that I wasn't fully understood, I wasn't fully seen, I wasn't fully heard. So what was happening simultaneously was that I had started experiencing a lot of physical symptoms as well, which the doctors also couldn't explain. So things like digestive difficulties, stomach cramps, body tension, and things like this, which they couldn't find any cause for. So after spending really a number of years, I think it was like 2 or 3 years, going through these systems around digestive health and not being able to find any issues, and then going round and around the system, I started to look for alternative treatments for this, which is what led me to somehow end up at a flotation tank centre. Because someone I met recommended that this could be helpful for these kind of issues, where there might be an emotional aspect to what you're experiencing physically. And that's where I had a real turning point in terms of the spiritual perspective, because I met somebody there who was very knowledgeable about yoga philosophy, and generally spirituality, but he really was the first person to start to help me see that what I was experiencing as great struggle wasn't about that there being something wrong with me necessarily, like a pathology, anxiety, depression, or these kind of diseases of the mind or disorders of the mind, but as something that could help pivot me into a transformation and to help to see things differently and expand my consciousness, you might say. And what he would do was he would give me instructions before I went into the flotation tank, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is essentially a pod that you get into that's full up with really, really highly concentrated magnesium water. So essentially you float to the top of the tank as if you're in the Dead Sea. You just you feel weightless, and you're in pitch black because it's covered over, and in silence, or with some nice nature sounds if you like. And in that space, you can meditate, you can just relax. But what he would do is actually give me sort of meditative exercises and visualization exercises and certain positions of my body to bring about more transcendental states. And essentially, for the first time, I was able to explore shifts in my consciousness and having the ability to control shifts in my consciousness. So up until that point, I thought that experiencing a barrage of anxious thoughts all the time about social interactions or my body or just fears about me being in the world was a necessity. That I just thought that's who I was. But through those experiences in the flotation tank, it gave me access to a sense of relaxation of the mind that I don't think I'd ever experienced up until that point. It was sort of like it gave me a pass to experience that deeper, more relaxed mind. And I remember the first time getting out of the tank, I'd have been there for about an hour, and I stepped out into the lobby area, and I remember there was another guy who'd been in the room next door, and he was coming out at the same time. And normally my mind would just be racing. Do I need to speak to this person? Do I not speak to them? I don't know how to behave. These kind of thoughts I used to have, and that just wasn't there. And I felt like fairly calm and okay. And it's crazy now thinking about it that was just so profound for me at the time, but it really, really was. So I went, I stayed with the flotation tank world for probably about 9 or 10 months, or most part of a year. I was really going there a lot and learning a lot from my friend there and exploring it. And he actually recommended that I started with, was it Yoga with Adrienne at the time? This was about 10 years ago. So she'd really just started making a very small following at the time. And he recommended that I watch her videos. So that then just started to, and at the time I thought, what's yoga? Who is this? I don't no idea what this was about. But it really shifted me into a different place where I started to think about, it's not just about mental health being something wrong with you, but about optimizing your well-being, your growth, your development, who you are in the world, being your best version. All of these kinds of phrases and ideas started to come into my world at this point. So that was really a change.
Can I just see if I'm summarizing correctly? Because it sounds to me like there's two things going on. So one is that you experience a shift in consciousness that allows you to have a relaxed state that you didn't know was possible. So whether that remains or not, you can see that, okay, this is possible. There's something I can move towards. And the other thing I'm hearing, and you just alluded to it there seems to be that your friend has helped you perhaps re-see the anxiety, the body dysmorphia, even maybe the physical discomfort, whatever's going on, as away from being just a crap thing that's happening to you that you need to get rid of, to maybe there's something in this, like maybe the key to my soul is contained in the suffering, and by pulling on that thread, it's going to open up and reveal deeper aspects of me and ultimately take me into a new kind of world. And I think is that an accurate summation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the experience of relief that I gained through suddenly having that calmer state of mind as I exited the tank, and the gratitude I felt to him for that, superseded the sense that anxious mind was who I was, and that was my identity, and that was my lot, and that was my plight, and that was going to be it for the rest of my life. That narrative just started to fall away because I had a better narrative. There was something that I then could believe in that was different to that, which was, okay, maybe there's more of this, maybe there's more space. And I think the reason, I've reflected on this before, as to why was it that really shifted it for me? Because I there was friends that I recommended the flotation tank to at the time, I remember, and I was going around saying, you've got to try this thing. And I had friends that would do it, and oh, it was interesting. Or sometimes they would actually say they felt it almost it increased their anxiety a bit being in the tank and things. It didn't quite seem to work in the same way as it had, or it didn't really quite have the same impact. So I think for me, it was that I was really ready to let go of the the way that I'd been living and experiencing and thinking and behaving. And this shift in consciousness offered a way out of that and something that my whole being was ready to embrace. So yes, I think it was this sense that something needed to change at that point. There wasn't an option to stay where I was. I had to shift out of it. I had to shift to this new state. And it was an expanded state of consciousness, and it was something very different. I remember one of the exercises he gave me, which wasn't to do in the tank actually, it was to do just in my daily life, that really shifted things for me, was to go about my day, and whenever something seemingly negative happened, to shift it into a positive. And it sounds like a really simple exercise, but I was really, really affected by it, because I remember I was on the way to work, and I was working up in Old Street in London at the time, this consultancy. And so on the commute on the way to work, I was walking to the escalator, and the escalator was really busy, and and everything was smelly, and I was just doing it in my head. Oh, look, oh, maybe it's a good thing that it's busy. Like, we're all here together, isn't that nice? I was just trying, and so it was these kind of thought experiments that really helped me to understand that I had the power to shape my reality. And for me, that was huge. That was absolutely huge, when I'd felt so shackled by my reality up to that point. So again, I think that's why for me I was so ready, I was ready to take that pill, as it were. It's like, yeah, absolutely ready to let go of everything that I've held.
Okay, so do you want to talk us through the next, I suppose, several years go by, ultimately leading you to make a career change into becoming a therapist? I don't know how you was got to be so much in that journey. I don't know how you would pluck out the most important parts of it, but I'll ask you to give that a go. Anyway, that journey up until you becoming a therapist, and how your sense of yourself, your body dysmorphia shifted over that time, maybe where it was stubborn in places, and what insights you gained there.
Yeah, so as you mentioned previously, so I had once I left university, I went into and decided I wanted to be a service designer. So essentially a facilitator, working with organizations to help them to understand issues and then come up with insights to solve those issues and challenges. And that extended to community development work as well. So it wasn't just kind of public sector or corporate organizations, it was on the ground community. So it was a promising, exciting career to me, and it brought together a lot of my skills and interests in anthropology and research, but also creating things in the world and running projects and working with people. Because despite having a lot of anxiety, I have always been a people person, and always been very driven to help people and help people understand each other better. So for me, it felt like the right path. And I was surrounded by lots of very, very smart people who'd gone to Oxford and Cambridge, and consultants that were really high-flying individuals, very, very sharp, smart people. But eventually I reached a bit of a limit with all of that, because simultaneously I had been doing a lot of my own deep exploration of myself, of my mind, of the human mind, of what is this all about, of started to explore spirituality, spiritual texts. And it eventually reached a point where I found myself feeling like I wasn't in the right place. I was sort of like I was an imposter in the environments I was in the consultancy environments I was in, because this sense of I didn't feel fully authentic. And I felt that my impact was better spent elsewhere. I really, really felt a calling to help people to understand themselves better and to be at greater peace. And what I saw around me in these environments was a great, a tremendous drive to want to help lots of people in the social impact world and do lots of projects, do lots of things. But what I fundamentally saw behind all of that was a lot of people who were struggling and quite lost and confused. And so I thought that it would be difficult for me to really have the impact I wanted to have in the world in these spaces where there was still so much confusion. And the real work would be to understand as much as I could about the mind and the spirit, or about the human, and then take that knowledge and apply it to helping either individuals or organizations eventually. But that I really needed to get to the root of things. And I've always been that way. I've always needed to get to the bottom of things. I leave no stone unturned. I find it really hard just to skim the surface of things, which has been a bit of a blessing and a curse. But yeah, that's where I was at. So I was exploring different courses and things that could be a good fit for my particular worldview at that time of psychotherapy and what I felt could work, which was much more in the mind-body space as opposed to just pure talking psychotherapy. And I wanted to do something that had a body-based somatic aspect. So I actually ended up doing a yoga therapy training, primarily because the course, it had a really good mix of being both informed by the Western science and the neuroscience and the physiology and the anatomy and that worldview, but also the spiritual and perspective of the human being, and it looked at things very holistically and was very comprehensive. So I trained with that school for a few years whilst I was still working in the consultancy world. And then I, over the last year, have done the integrative psychotherapy arm of that course. So have honed in on that aspect of it. But essentially my training was covering the body-based yoga therapy side and the integrative psychotherapy, blending a whole mix of modalities and looking really at the most contemporary view of how we deal with people.
Okay, so this training is presumably going on alongside a continuous development with yourself in terms of a deepening of positive characteristics that you referred to. So there's this moment where you start to think about mental health as well-being and a kind of expansion into becoming more, not just a getting back to an even keel. So that's going on. And there's also the darker side of things with the body dysmorphia, which is there at the start, and then I think it shifts as you go along. So I'd maybe like you to speak to that kind of inner development you're going through and come round to the point of how that influences the work you're doing with other people now. I suppose how you feel your particular approach and your change of like the frame of reference into a more spiritual, if you like, frame of reference has been integral, if it has been integral, to a shifting in things like body dysmorphia and whatever else you'd want to talk about. So right now, I'm really just sort of leaving it open because I suppose I'd like people listening to get a sense of what kind of shift is possible, how a shift in perspective might facilitate that, and what it is that your work is doing, if you see where I'm going. So you take the floor and answer that however you wish to.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think it's important just to rewind a little bit and just say a bit about my personal inner exploration that was going on while I was working in the consultancy world and sort of struggling a bit with those systems and where I wanted to be in the world. So I had been struggling with body dysmorphia, as we call it, and discovered an organization called the Body Dysmorphic Foundation. And through that, I was actually led to you, Richard, because a mutual friend of ours, Nicole, and I, who's written a book about many books about body dysmorphia. So I did a bit of work with her. She was interviewing me actually for some research about people with body dysmorphia, young people, because at the time I think I was about 24. And through that, she recommended that I speak to you because you were doing a study looking at exploring body dysmorphia from a spiritual perspective and using techniques like meditation and going into deeper states of consciousness to look at this a different way. And I was really, really interested in that because I had been exploring some things with the flotation tanks and I was sort of getting a bit interested in that idea. And I remember also just feeling very open to anything. You know, I was just like very, very driven to 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 get better. That's how I felt it. I just felt like I'm not really fully being the best I can be. And if anything can help me, then I'll be up for it and I'll do it with full heart and mind. So we started working together and having some sessions, and you led me through some meditation exercises essentially, or going into a deeper state of being. And that was very profound because I think that was the first time where I'd gone into those deeper states with somebody else. Up until that point, it'd always been me on my own, but that was the first time it was a kind of a relational meditation in a way, and being guided into something in such a personal level with somebody was profound in terms of that relationship. So yeah, and I think it really, again, it gave me that sense of being able to separate to some degree from the anxiety and the turmoil that I would experience around certain thoughts and feelings that I was having, whether it would be about social interactions or body or any aspect of myself that just felt very frantic. I was able to sit back into something that felt deeper. And at the time, I don't think I fully grasped what was happening fully, but I remember just a sense of feeling, this feels good. This feels supportive. This feels like where I'm meant to be somehow. This feels good. I'm something that I should keep doing. So from that experience, I ended up doing a course in Glastonbury that was called a diploma in practical spirituality and wellness. And it was with an organization called the Spiritual Companions Trust, who I think are incredible and amazing. Shout out to them. So I, for a year, worked with them, essentially learning how to meditate, really learning how to meditate. So we would go and we would spend sometimes up to an hour meditating in group and really learn about what the benefits of it were, the science, the evidence behind that. And it really was the first course that I did that helped me to understand how I could be of service to others through my presence, through listening, through not giving advice, but simply reflecting and helping people come to their own insight and understanding. So it was essentially a kind of spiritual counseling course, but there was much more to it than that. So that really gave me confidence in a different way of being in the world. That cemented something for me, that actually my preferred way of being with people was this deeper, calmer, wiser aspect of myself that felt better when I was in that place. And I was with people who were confirming that I could be in that place and I could serve from that place. So that was an incredibly profound series of interactions and experiences. And I think that really set me up for for everything that I went on to value and take on as my way, my approach since then. Is very much about providing people with that calm, safe presence, empowering them to find what's right for them and guide them there, but not push them there or force them or tell them how to do it. And really gave me a much deeper appreciation for there being something beyond my mind and body that was ever present and supporting and holding me and everyone else.
Okay, so I often think or find even that being with myself and providing that sort of calm, spacious presence to myself informs how I then am with other people. And being with other people and being calm and spacious to them and giving them a space to fill up also informs how I am with myself. And I see different aspects of it coming through so that they move forward together. So I'm wondering, I mean, I'm assuming you would relate to that. Okay, but I'm wondering when you're learning to cultivate this presence, to be with either yourself or others, what's arising for you internally in terms of insight into things like body dysmorphia? So just to give an example, you mentioned our friend Nicole, Dr. Nicole, Dr. Nicole Stackelberg, and I think she would say something like in her voluminous writing on body dysmorphia at this point that she saw it as a way she noticed in society people were loved for their physicality, so therefore if she could perfect her physicality she would then be lovable, and that relates back to a core sense of unlovability. So a lot of Nicole's work was centered on that, that body dysmorphia is not an issue of perception. It's not just that there's you have a hyper attuned perception and you need to get a more cognitive clear image of your actual appearance, and then that will start to calm down. There's something going on at the deepest of deep levels in terms of my core sense of who I am that then gets tagged on the body. The body is just a placeholder for that. So I wonder what insight is arising within you as you go into this calmer presence with yourself, and how that then shifts your perception of yourself and allows for a greater degree of freedom to arise.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of an ever evolving theory I have about body dysmorphia and anxiety in general, really. But I think body dysmorphia is a particularly interesting one. And I can only really go on my personal experience and insights, but also the work that I've done with other people and the work that I do with people who experience or have experienced body dysmorphia. I would agree that there is within the body dysmorphic mind, we might say, the energy that holds that body dysmorphic set of thoughts, feelings, emotions, has within it the narrative of being unlovable because one's appearance isn't right or something, and that formula is existing, that kind of algorithm is existing in that software, we might say. But I would say that maybe I would disagree slightly with that core sense of unlovability being absolutely kind of tied to the individual, the identity. I think that once we get beneath that algorithm, that body dysmorphic energy piece, there is I can't think of a better way than saying that there is a soul there. There is a kind of pure essence there, which is it's eternally loving and knows it's loved and is safe and pure and it's okay. It's always there and it's okay. But that sense of the body dysmorphia comes into to protect that soul. It's functioning to protect and to defend, and that can run very, very, very deep, almost to the point that the soul feels like a pinprick, but it's always there. That spark is always there. So in my work now, what I see is that the job is to fan that flame really allow that spaciousness of that soul to exist, and know that it can exist, that it's welcome, that it's wanted, and that it's safe to be here. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Could you,
it's
yeah, maybe just
something a
pass
bit.
the bit about protective mechanism, Adam, maybe just pass that out a bit more in terms of, so let me see if I'm understanding what you're saying. The dysmorphia arises as a protective mechanism against a kind of wounding, or you tell me what you mean by protective mechanism.
Yes, no, I think that's exactly it. I think there's a protective mechanism that's at play to protect from a wounding that might have happened very, very early. But I'm really getting to the point now of thinking that there's potentially that this could go back even to the womb level, or even before. Who knows? Like I think that sometimes it's those defenses and protective mechanisms of thoughts and emotions about one's body being oneself and gripping onto that, it can happen very, very early on, but there is a possibility of getting underneath it. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, I think we should return to that because I know you and I have had, I would call it a disagreement, but we've had a conversation from different perspectives about the nature of memory. Okay, so that'll be a good future one. I think maybe for now, um, would you? It would just be good to hear before we round this section off about the shift that's made. Okay, so is your dysmorphia as strong as it was when you were 20 in university, or has insight arisen that has allowed you to attain freedom from it? Just not to, I don't want to bury the lead, if you like, in terms of, I want to have that more
Yeah,
important.
no, thank you. So I think that the way that I operate and function in the world is completely drastically different to how I did in my early 20s, not just because of the age difference and the experience. I do think that I I just have a very different view. Now there might still be body dysmorphic thoughts that arise, of feelings of ugliness, of deformity, of those kinds of spirals of those kind of patterns. But the difference now is that I observe it for what it is, and I have a very tangible space between me and it. It's a very felt sense of space and distance with it, to see it for what it is. And with that, I'm able to quite quickly reappraise it, if we say, and understand, okay, that's actually to do with how I'm feeling right now, and I can understand it in that way.
So, in that
Also,
sense, when it arises, is it a sense of something you want to get rid of, or something that is opening you up to, like alerting you there's something sort of deeper going on within you in those moments?
that's exactly it. So rather than trying to run away from it or push it away, or say it's wrong or try and hide it, now I see it as an invitation. I feel like I'm in communication with it,
Mm.
and we're on the same team. Um,
Okay.
so
Yeah,
that.
because this is the thing, right? About like, of course, anyone who's really struggling with this, if they could, pay $1 million to get rid of it, they do that. We're both British. I don't know why we're talking in dollars, but um, you know what I mean, okay? So, but there is a sense then of maybe it's an appropriate kind of siren, right? If it rings and goes quiet again when it's needed, but when it's not tended to, it just becomes a blaring siren that's going off 24/7 and leads to 18 hours a day mirror gazing or something, and just it's never silent. So, but at the same time, it is a functional part of us, like in a sense that all these qualities we might think of as negative, like depression or anything, could have a functional role in stopping us running off a cliff, metaphorically speaking, or an alert as to what's going on within us. If it's like an appropriately integrated part of our system, but not a part of our system that's disintegrated and therefore running wild. Would that be a
Yeah.
fair summation of what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's just a felt sense of confidence I have now in my ability to see it for what it is, and really parent it. I know there's a lot of talk about inner child work, and um yeah, I think inner child work is great, but what I'm really referring to is that ability to recognize that it feels like quite a young part of me, And my default, my automatic now is really to parent that part and see, oh, okay, oh no, you're just feeling a bit stressed, or there's something going on now. Come this way, it's going to be okay, and that comes in pretty much immediately now. And actually, what I think it does as well is that it's made me more empathic to others and more understanding of others' suffering, we might say, in a similar way, and whether that be with body dysmorphia, whether that be with addiction, with substance abuse, whatever it is, I can understand that a similar mechanism is happening in the other person. And so in order to be of most service to them and to help them, I recognize that it's those qualities of being a wise adult, a wise parent in a way in the room to guide, is really what's appropriate and what's needed, as opposed to what I think many of us can do when we're wanting to help, but we can go into I need to fix this other person, I need to tell them what to do, and coming from quite a reactive place. So I feel that I'm now much more confident and comfortable in understanding what those more wild fragments of ourselves are about, and how to best support them back to wholeness, back to integration.
Okay, I think we're coming to a point where it would be really good to round up. So I would like you, before we do that, I suppose three things. One is your contact details, which I will put in the info box, whatever platform people are listening, so they can find onto this on, so they can find out more about your work, how to get in touch with you. And the second thing would be, I suppose, anything else you want to say at all. And finally, I'd like you to maybe summarize with some heartfelt aspiration. Okay, if you get in touch with that, about what you want to bring to people through your work, like just to end on that note of your aspiration for what you're doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So people can find me, they can contact me at anna.warhurst@gmail.com. So just at my email. I offer integrative psychotherapy primarily, but that really involves a whole mixture of psychotherapeutic approaches, some somatic movement approaches. Some things can be a little bit more geared towards goals or personal development aspects of people's lives. If they want that, it's really depending on the individual as to what they're looking for.
And you do
But
work online, is an
I
important
do
thing.
work
Yeah.
online. Yes, yeah, at the moment I do work online. But yeah, I'd say that primarily my mission, or my hope for working with people, and what I stand for, is really allowing people to get in touch with the deepest aspects of themselves, that know intuitively what they want and where they're going, and just help to instill that confidence in that deeper knowing and operating from there. So going from that being mode to doing mode, and helping to make that link for people so that they're congruent, and so they're able to act in their integrity and their authenticity, and really be the best people they can be. I am a big believer in the heart, and I think that we need a lot more love in our lives. We need to acknowledge that we are made of love ultimately. So I really I hope to bring that sense back to people, that they are a spiritual being on this planet having a human experience, and I really just to help people to be at greater peace with themselves and do the things in the world that they want to do while they're here. So yeah, that's me.
Anna Warhurst, thank you very much.
Thank you.